I would always ask my father, why did you pick Haverhill? What was it about Haverhill? And he really loved the peacefulness.
The neighborhood, it is changing, and there's so much we can do for each other, and we're so strong when we work together.
Either going to someplace or coming from someplace, and what I'm seeing a lot more of, there are more people not using Haverhill as a stepping stone and more putting down the roots here. A lot of those old buildings, even the ones that are a little rough on the outside, they've seen a lot of lives lived in them. It also makes it a very special place, almost kind of sacred a little bit when you think about, all of the history that has happened there.
I don't know if Hebron adopt us or we adopt Hebron, but truly, Hebron is our home.
I'm Vince Sapola, President and CEO of Historic New England. We just heard from residents of Haverhill, Massachusetts about the changing city they call home. Haverhill was a thriving mill town in the 19th century and a hub of shoe manufacturing in the early 20th. Today, the city is tapping into its historic resources to become even more livable, equitable, and ready for the opportunities of the 21st century. It's converting former mill buildings into housing and using public art to celebrate its dynamic history, its legacy in shoe manufacturing, and to illuminate its future. This building on Essex Street, right across from the Haverhill commuter rail station, combines Haverhill's industrial past and its creative future. It is the home of Historic New England's collections and conservation center. Once itself a shoe factory, it currently houses the most extensive collection of New England artifacts anywhere. Tens of thousands of pieces of artwork, furniture, clothing, and household objects of all kinds line the shelves of this 8-story structure. And every single one tells a different story about the people who lived in New England over the centuries. Beyond these walls, Historic New England's 38 museum sites, farms, and landscapes reveal our shared history and experience. Thank you for joining us for this very special journey of Historic New England. Make history. Here in Haverhill, we're surrounded by objects that served essential functions in people's daily lives. Join us now for a conversation about why ordinary objects are important in recording the past, along with a look at what Historic New England is doing to capture history as it happens today.
What for me makes the experience of working with Historic New England so special, which is in fact, as you so succinctly said, is the stuff. What are the things that we get to work with? And as a material culture person, I find that one of the most fascinating things at this point in my career that I like looking at with Historic New England is something that you and I have talked about before, which is like the idea of life cycle of collecting.
There's a term you mentioned that I'd like to get into more. That was material culture. It sounds kind of mysterious, but can you explain to us what it means?
Well, in its most sort of basic meaning, material culture is anything that is created by human endeavor. So whether it is a piece of pottery or a sharpening flint, whether it's ceramics, whether it's textiles, we use the term material culture to apply to anything that's been created by human hands. And that's sort of the basic description, which means that you cover a tremendous amount of material by talking about material culture. They also allow us to tell stories that we might not normally be able to tell. In the last decade of the 18th century, there were huge changes in the shoemaking industry. And as I started looking at one company in particular, one shoemaking business in particular, they went from selling hundreds of shoes to thousands of shoes. And I noticed this in their account book, and I thought, well, this is curious. And then I started looking at where the shoes were going and realized they were being sent south. So these were shoes that were being created for, and the language was very, very, very coded. They would call it for the Southern trade or the Indies trade. But basically the shoes were being sent down to large plantations. The ports of call were Norfolk, Charleston, Baltimore, and then being sent south at low cost for enslaved workers. It's always exciting when you can sort of give voice to those who have been denied a voice.
One of the great things about Historic New England is that we're capturing history as it happens. Whether it's helping to conserve objects from the Boston Marathon bombing, or documenting people's lives at home during the global pandemic, or giving voice to some of the region's little-known communities through our Everyone's History series. Historic New England understands we need to save the stories of the present before they're lost. Historic New England preserves old houses and objects, farms, landscapes, but we're doing so in new and innovative ways. This organization's constantly looking to the future. We're planning for climate resiliency. We're caring for our collections in environmentally sustainable ways. And we're shifting the focus of the stories we tell to be broader and more inclusive at our historic sites.
Ona Judge was an African-American woman who escaped enslavement at the home of George and Martha Washington and sought refuge in New Hampshire. Cyrus Bruce was a freedman who worked at the home of the state's governor, John Langdon. At Governor Langdon House in Portsmouth, Historic New England is teaming up with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire to tell their stories.
We believe that knowing the stories of early African Americans in our state allows us to really talk about not only their story, but how we got to where we are and why we do what we do around healing and creating an understanding and making our dialogues around race much easier. Ona Marie Judge was born in Mount Vernon in around 1774, and she was enslaved to George Washington and Martha Washington. Every 6 months, they would change their servants over. It was on one of those times that Ona just packs up and leaves, and she ends up in Portsmouth. One of these days, Ona was walking in downtown Portsmouth in the marketplace, and Elizabeth Langdon was also in the marketplace, and she sees and she recognizes Ona Judd, and she knows the Washingtons were looking for their runaway slave. And of course, she passes this information on to John Langdon, and Washington finds out that this indeed is where Ona ends up. This is how the John Langdon house becomes a part of Ona's story, part of the history, is when Washington sends his nephew, and they're at dinner, talking about, their desire to really capture Ona, unexpectedly put her on a ship and take her back to Pennsylvania. Cyrus Bruce, Governor Langdon's maitre d', was there, and they heard the story. And we know that Ona was warned about that this was happening, and we think it was Cyrus Bruce who actually warned her that the slave catchers were coming. Cyrus Bruce was known to be the most well-dressed man of color in Portsmouth.
Cyrus Bruce, I like to believe, was the guy of the door. Yes, he opened that door, he shut that door. He was in charge of the people knocking at that door. He was in charge. You could see that he has respect for himself and had a strong character.
He also held the same position among the enslaved people and free people of color in Portsmouth as Governor John Langdon. So he was very influential within that community. Ona Marie Judge escapes the president's home at least 3 times that we know about, and she is never caught. Washington dies before she could be free, or before she could be returned to him. She said she'd rather die free than live in sex luxury. These stories, when we tell them, when we reintroduce them to our collective memory, helps us to really go beyond stereotypes, helps us to go beyond what we think a person is just by looking at the color of their skin. The Langdon House is also looking at its history of African Americans that had lived there, what their story is, and how those stories connect to the wider story of enslavement and freedom in our state. It's American history. It's a fuller, more complex history that we have to look at. And I think these historic homes are really starting to look at that. Who were the servants in the house? Like Cyrus Bruce, we have a silver tray that we know he used. But what was his story? Where did he come from? What was a Black community like in Portsmouth?
Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail and the Langdon House asked me to be the artist in residence to create an image of an invisible or faceless man, Cyrus Bruce, and I was thrilled. I was going to get the opportunity to make an invisible man visible.
It is through these material cultures, these houses that remain, the items that remain, the tray, the brick from the home in the back that Cyrus Bruce is supposed to have lived at, the silver buckle that we know he wore on his shoe. We're excited to work with Historic New England and their property Langdon House in Portsmouth, not only for the research that we can do, but also that we can actually go in, visit this property, see the house, be in that physical space. We usually tell Ona's story. We've not told Cyrus Bruce's story. And we want to imagine what a conversation between George Washington and Cyrus Bruce was like. We know that there was respect between John Langdon and Cyrus Bruce. But what is that? What is that relationship? These historic homes, putting people in those places in the past, in conversations that we thought could happen, broadens our imaginations and create these bridges of understanding.
Walter Gropius sparked a design revolution when he founded the Bauhaus School in Germany in 1919. Nearly 2 decades later, he brought his vision to Massachusetts when he took a position at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. The house he built for his family in a Boston suburb changed our idea of a New England home forever.
My inner feelings, yearnings, everything was suddenly answered by the Bauhaus. But at that time, I was first not interested in the man. I was interested in his idea.
When I went to the Gropius house as a young person, I thought, wow, things could be different. Things don't need to be what I'm experiencing day to day. And I think it was very influential in terms of me ultimately becoming an architect, along with visiting cities around the world and having that same experience that things could be different.
Gropius House, like many other historic house museums associated with modern architecture, attracts visitors from all over the world. Why are people so interested in mid-century modern houses?
Well, it's so, what I find so ironic is this was really a Japanese tradition that made its way to Europe, and then, during World War II or right before, made its way to the United States through figures like Gropius and so forth. And today it's like whether you watch an early Columbo episode or Don Draper, it's become so iconic because it really is a radically different way of living than the way in the West, especially, we thought about living. It still, I think, perpetuated certain stereotypes about women's role in the house, about race and so forth that we're still working through, but it was such a break with tradition in an important way that I think it's something that we still look to in terms of how to kind of transform society.
How would you say Gropius and the Bauhaus influenced architecture and design in the United States? I know, big question.
Well, obviously huge implications. Some of it went on to corporate modernism, which got quite banal. I think, I'm a big fan of Professor Ken Frampton's work around critical regionalism, the idea that modernism isn't just universal, but is responding to local culture and local climate. I know Gropius himself believed in that at a certain level. And the battle rages on today. My wife and I are both architects. We're trying to design a very subtle, green, modern home in a village that considers itself to be very traditional. And there are those that really can't take it. And I think in the United States especially, we have a somewhat insecure version of our own history. Unlike in Asia and in Europe, where people, I think, have more comfort with their own history, so they're not threatened by a piece of modern architecture. But here we're still getting through that because people try to cling to Eurocentric traditions or so forth because they are trying to cling to a sense of history because they feel uneasy about it. And so I think that is an ongoing dialogue in architecture.
The story of Gropius House is at heart an immigrant story, a family story. Why is it important for people to know about the lives of significant architects?
I think this is such an important point. My wife and I are both first-generation immigrants. I think it does influence the way you come at things. You know, we are at a moment of huge racial upheaval in society. We're trying to understand each other across different religions and belief systems. And so I do think an artist is influenced by their background. And, you know, you can see that in the work of the way, say, an immigrant might look at something. You know, in the history of the Bauhaus, you know, many fled because of persecution under the rise of Hitler, but others, you know, Mies van der Rohe, fantastic architect, but did try to cozy up to Hitler at a certain point. And I think that shows the sort of difference in background and how one might approach these things. I know, you know, in my office, we're designing a project in Mongolia, and I know as a fellow Asian that I probably approach that project differently than I think I would if I had a different background. So I don't think we should read too much into it, but I do think it's quite critical in terms of understanding art and architectural history. Modernism was never a static idea. It was always about, you know, changes in technology, changes in society, and how that would influence architecture. And I think that's just as relevant today. The litmus test is, did a building progress its movement? Did it progress its genre? Or was it simply repetitive in its genre? And I think that's where we look to preservation to understand how was that building groundbreaking within its genre, right? And I think that's what constitutes a landmark.
Author Sarah Orne Jewett and interior designer Henry Davis Sleeper were leaders in their creative fields. Today, Historic New England welcomes visitors to tour their homes in South Berwick, Maine, and Gloucester, Massachusetts. Jewett's relationship with writer and activist Annie Adams Fields and Sleeper's identity as a gay man challenge us to question what we think we know about same-sex relationships in the past. Find out what these historic houses reveal about LGBTQ plus identity in New England at the turn of the 20th century.
Are you sure you know how much I love you? If you don't, I can't tell you. But I think of you, and I'm always being reminded of you. I am yours most lovingly. S.O.J.
Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields were part of this incredible, wide-ranging circle, multi-generational of New England women writers who relied on one another for support, for inspiration, and as much as they wrote letters to one another, they had nicknames for one another. They saw each other when they could, but they also spoke to each other through their work. So when you pair the letters with the photographs and also with their published works, their poems, their letters, their essays, their novels, there's often coded references in the texts that kind of call out the friendship.
I have been reading Under the Olive a good deal in the last day or two, and I can't begin to tell you how beautiful it is to me, and how helpful. I long to hear you read from it again, and when I think it was my dear little Fuffy who wrote it, it seems quite amazing. It is like remembering that I have dared to talk nonsense and hug and play generally with something that turned itself into a whole world full of thoughts and sights and beautiful things.
What visual records of Jewett's relationship to Annie Fields did you perceive in the house?
For me, in the Jewett house, I think I learned the most in the bedrooms, in the hallway, in the in-between spaces. You can see the way in which they arranged their spaces to be constantly connected to one another, even though they were quite often apart, you know, with Fields at her summer house in Manchester or on Charles Street in Boston at her home. And I think it's these spaces the more intimate spaces, personal spaces, private spaces, where you begin to see this.
What is the lost world of female behavior, the deeply felt same-sex friendships in the 19th century?
In the 20th and 21st centuries, I think we tend to put friendship in one corner and love in another corner. For Jewett and Fields, the reinterpretation of their friendship and of their love for one another and of their relationships, I think people struggle with looking for evidence of trying to fit them into the relationship categories that we have in the 21st century. And it's that very complexity that I think is the most interesting thing about the house is just expanding and broadening our horizons as to what's possible in a relationship between two people in the 19th century.
Sometimes it is said that in the past, historians have censored same-sex relationships, such as the one between Jewett and Fields. But there's also a self-censorship sometimes. And Annie Adams Fields destroyed some of her letters to Jewett. What do you think about the idea of not repeating the censorship in reinterpretation?
We can never see it all. We can never fully recreate any historical relationship. But I think the more you can bring out into the open for people to see the life as it was actually lived is so important for people now to see themselves in the past and in the present.
I first came to Beauport in fall of 2012. The sense of kind of joy in that house as you go from one room to the next. And there's a kind of fun house quality to Beauport. And you really get a sense that this is someone who is not playing by the rules. This is someone who is really kind of playing his own game.
At Beauport, we began talking about Henry Sleeper as a gay man in 2008. How important do you think that is for visitors?
Well, I think it's hugely important for the LGBT community who want to see themselves in these spaces. But beyond that, I think it's important for every person who comes into that house to understand Sleeper's full humanity. It is not the whole of his identity, but it is a very important part of it. And we certainly wouldn't ignore, for example, that he was from Boston. It's a part of his story. His, sort of sexual orientation, I think, is something that very much, in a lot of ways, dictated kind of the way he saw the world, the way he navigated it.
On the tour, we talk about, the challenges of interpreting LGBTQ history when oftentimes those stories have been erased by subsequent generations and even the individuals themselves. How should historians approach these hidden stories?
Archives often have, enormous absences, either due to generations, following the person's death, or even self-censorship, which is a huge problem as well that historians of these folks face. As a historian of LGBTQ subjects, I feel sometimes like I'm one of those archaeologists at Pompeii, right? Have you ever seen those bodies that they kind of recreate inside the cavities of the lava? They're able to recreate them by finding the absences. And I feel like that's part of my job as a historian of these folks, is to find the absences and kind of fill them back in. I think it can be as difficult for studying a straight subject as it is for someone from the LGBT community, because it really forces you to look at very small details, which often pay off. And those absences or silences that begin to tell us there's something here, or there was something here.
Having the Pride Tour itself initially at Beauport has actually led us to find more archival material than we even knew existed to begin with. But just the fact that we now had a place to be able to use it, people sort of came forward with things, that we didn't even know existed before.
This is why we read books and go to the theater and go to historic houses and go to virtual lectures. We, especially in this time, want to be outside of ourselves and our own spaces. I tend to think in terms of sets. And I have to say, so did these designers. Piatt Andrews' home, Red Roof, Beauport, Wrong Roof, even Fenway Court. They're all really elaborate stage sets for a particular set of characters. And they all played their parts kind of exquisitely. And lucky for us, we get to walk onto the stage too.
So what's great about Historic New England is that, especially in this age of teardowns and overdevelopment, that they're making sure that these open spaces are protected and accessible to everyone to experience and enjoy. We aren't just about preserving buildings and objects. I think it's important to note that we preserve these gardens, the forests, the farmlands, and primarily the open space that's all a part of everyone's collective memory. We have over 1,200 acres of gardens and land and protected areas across New England that are open to the public thanks to Historic New England. So you visit a place like Lyman Estate in Waltham and you realize that you're so close to metropolitan Boston, but suddenly you're transported back to this 18th century home and you forget that you're 10 miles from downtown Boston. And this happens everywhere in all of the properties, whether it's the Roseland Cottage in Connecticut or the Codman Estate in Lincoln. Suddenly the places, the objects, and the buildings all come together and you have a really much deeper understanding of the people that live there. So for landscape designers, I think these are essential resources, these spaces. I think design professionals in general should be interested in history because we all draw on it. It's all a part of our collective memory. I've really felt that during this pandemic, the availability of open space is even more critical for people to relax and enjoy and reconnect, to get outside, to become a little bit more engaged in the landscape and as much as they can with each other. You can gather outdoors, you can do yoga, you can walk your dog in the fresh air in a safe place. And these are the type of spaces that we need more of, where everyone is welcome to relax and breathe the air, no matter who you are. And I think at the essence, these places make the region more livable and more vital. I think these places matter to me and to a lot of other people. And I believe that when a historic place is cherished by so many people, you need an organization like Historic New England to make sure that they are protected and stewarded for the next and future generations to enjoy.
Casey Farm in Saunderstown, Rhode Island is Historic New England's most visited historic site, with a popular summer camp program, weekly farmers markets, and a CSA. The indigenous Narragansett people cultivated this land long before it was claimed by English settlers in the 18th century. Historic New England is joining with Rhode Island's Tamaqua Museum to decolonize this working organic farm and share the indigenous experience with the community.
Way ha, way ha, way, way, oh, way ha, way ha, way ha, way, way, oh, way ha. You know weekend, you know weekend, way hey, you know weekend nooks. Namaucut, that is the name of this place. The Casey family, they actually named the farm space Namaucut, which is just an Englishized version of the Narragansett word that means the place of the fish. The Nahaigansak people are the people of this place, and we are connected to everything in this place. Our ancestors not only hunted and fished and gathered, but they also grew crops. And we had the gift of the corn that came. Our traditional story is that the crow brought that corn to us. And the crow, even today, is revered in our community for giving us that gift and helping us to have that sustainable food source that made us a strong people, along with all the gifts of the land and the sea and the fresh waters and the forests and the fields. And the three sisters, the corn is the big sister, and it grows first, and it grows strong and tall. The second is the bean that wraps around the corn but gives nutrients back to the soil that today we call nitrogen. And then the squash, which is the third sister, whose job is to keep the moisture in the ground and utilizing those big leaves to keep that moisture in the ground. And so they work together. Today we use a science word, a symbiotic relationship. But we realize as Indigenous people, we are related to everything.
Casey Farm is one of Historic New England's sites that are open to the public, And we have different educational programs that we run here for people of all ages. And it's also a Rhode Island certified organic working farm. The modern agricultural methods that we use go hand in hand beautifully with the methods of the past. When people come to KC Farm, they usually recognize immediately that it's a beautiful, peaceful place. It's beautiful in a different way every day. The vegetables and the fruits and the eggs that are produced here on the farm are sold at our farmers market that happens every Saturday morning. We have CSA members, community supported agriculture, who are able to pick up their share of organic vegetables every week and pick their own herbs and flowers. We have kids here for summer camp, and we also have a number of animals that are here mainly for educational purposes.
The Narragansett, of which I am a citizen, are a proud people, and we are still here and have a lot of our cultural knowledge. And that's despite King Philip's War and the Great Swamp Massacre. It's despite the continued dispossession of land. You know, people like to put the word purchase or sold into it, but you have to understand that the colonial powers that be were using every trick in the book in order to dispossess indigenous people of this region, not just of Rhode Island, but of what became all 13 colonies and what became the whole entire United States, to dispossess us of the land. Unfortunately for us, we've suffered more than 400 years of conquest and colonization and dispossession of the land, war, massacres, genocide, enslavement, subjugation, and all of these things took place over many years and continue even into the 21st century, which we often think of as historical trauma. Part of the reason we did the partnership with KC Farm was to decolonize this space and to remind people that not only were we here, but we're still here, and that indigenous people are connected to this place, even as it's being occupied by others. Yo no weekend, yo no weekend, we hey yo no weekend.
Climate change poses an existential threat to our ability to preserve historic buildings, landscapes, and objects for future generations. Preservation and conservation staff at Historic New England are planning now for climate resilience at our historic sites.
This is a building we can save for another 200, 300 years, but we need to be able to protect it from these effects of climate change. It is going to affect everything we do, whether we're talking about sea level rise, and if you think about New England and you think about all of these coastal cities with their historic buildings, all deep danger of getting kind of inundated by water from sea level rise. But then a house like the one we're at is sitting on a hill. We're not thinking about sea level rise here, but if the water is just continually attacking it from just the rainstorms, then it's going to lead to much deeper deterioration. I'm personally most concerned about the more frequent and intense rainstorms that we're having. And those really put a beating on the houses. They really overwhelm the gutter systems, they overwhelm the roofs, and we get leaking now in places that we haven't. About 3 years ago, we did a study in the state of Maine. So we looked at 7 of our own properties and 2 properties in the easement program. We started the project as, you know, what would happen in 50 years with our gutters, and we realized our gutters weren't even performing today for the rainstorms. Typically, it's a 10 or 20-year storm that gutters are designed for, but what we were finding was the data they were all based on was 20, 30 years old. And if you went to the Weather Service and got updated numbers of rain intensity, in Maine it was 25, 30, 40% more rain was falling in a given storm. What people aren't working on, which we're working on, is these little things, like we can make this building last a lot longer by making the gutter a little bit bigger or by changing some of the details in the buildings to better protect it against the effects of climate change. What we found in the study was actually sometimes our gutters were fine. They were sized appropriately, but at the end where the downspout was, there was a tiny, tiny little connector piece. And that connector piece wasn't big enough to handle the volume of water. And so all the water was kind of pouring out the side. Some was going down, but all of it was just rushing down the gutter to this small spot, which then just overflowed. And over time, that kind of constant influx of water and constant deterioration will take away the paint, it will get into the wood, it will get into the building ultimately and in the structure. So if you looked at our houses, you were seeing this pattern of wear and deterioration on the corners where these downspouts were. And that really highlighted to us some of these issues. And we've been really going through and starting to make those little connector points bigger wherever we can. So everything is going to have to adapt. We're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to kind of figure out how and where the lines of interpretation and the lines of just good stewardship and management and land conservation blend together. Recently, we did a 2-year project with Middlebury College. We had a cohort of interns, and the first year we had one intern who worked with us to really kind of develop some of our baseline strategic thinking about climate change and how it might affect historic buildings. With hotter summers and warmer winters, there's less opportunity to kind of cycle through the seasons now. There's a lot of just wet weather, and that's really affecting the properties. But it's not just the buildings, it's also the plants. We're finding the changes in temperature are affecting our trees, they're affecting how the different plant materials at our properties grow. And we like to kind of replace in kind, we like to interpret what's here, but if the growing cycle changes and all of a sudden this area isn't temperate for certain species, we have to think about other species of trees. And when that leads to other trees, it means there's different bugs that are interested in those trees, there's different wildlife, there's different fauna, and everything starts shifting, and we're not prepared for that shift. Today, based on the work of the Middlebury College students, we've been tackling the invasive species at many of those sites. We've been removing them and replanting with natives. We've been replacing some of the gutter components and redoing the gutters so that we can move the water more naturally. And of course, we're much more aware of how the Great Marsh interacts with the Spencer Pierce Little Farm and the importance of that feature to not just Spencer Pierce Little Farm, but to all of Newbury as a buffer zone for sea level rise. The history of these buildings, the architecture, how people designed and interacted with them is critically important. And one of the reasons is because they lived in a sustainable way. When they had these houses, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have central heating systems. They opened the windows, they figured out ways to not use fossil fuels for their properties. And we opened the front and rear door of a main central hall house, and the whole building ventilates the way it did 200 years ago. It still works today.
Nothing beats the authenticity of learning about history where it actually took place. In a normal year, Historic New England welcomes tens of thousands of children and adults to educational programs at historic sites. But in this year of the pandemic, the learning moved online. Our education staff put programs on video so that students could learn more from home. And we invited historians and authors to present online talks on a wide range of topics to a nationwide audience. Here are some highlights.
Thank you for joining us tonight from all over the region and really all over the country. It's great to have so many people together for this talk tonight.
It's actually the longest standing, longest lasting mass demonstration in this country since the 1960s. So, I tell this to people all the time. I tell it to my students. If it feels like you're living in a moment where a lot is happening, it's true. A lot is happening in this moment.
And it's been pieced back together.
The scientists and historians can learn a lot about the technology of the day back then. They can look at the materials it was made from, the glaze, the paint, and also the style of the artwork on there.
Historic New England has been a really big part of my career for the last 20 years. Every major and minor research project I've done in some way has brought me to Historic New England.
Movements that are going on today around redevelopment of various areas in the city and other parts of Greater Boston are ones to consider and follow, because there are going to be huge implications on families and the future of these communities.
Now, girls' and women's clothing did not have pockets sewn into it, so the pockets weren't a part of your garment. What you had instead were separate items called pockets that you tied around your waist.
Here in the parlor at Castle Tucker is the next most advanced problem in deterioration of wallpaper, where not only has the paste failed, but some insects have helped it fail by eating the paste.
IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, which is really a kind of philosophy of pest control. Essentially, we're trying to use multiple strategies and integrated strategies and reducing or eliminating our use of chemical pesticides. And so my role is to oversee mostly the insect pests interacting with our collections at our over 30 fully furnished houses regionally. We're looking out for particularly clothes moths and carpet beetles, which can be very highly destructive to our textile collections, our upholstery collections, any protein-based materials, but then also woodworm, wood-boring pests, furniture beetle. They can be really destructive to our wooden artifacts, and then sometimes even into the building structure, which is very serious.
There are a variety of ways to perform wood repairs without full replacement of historic fabric. And there are simple wood repairs that can be performed by a handy homeowner with the right tools and a little know-how. So this is a simple repair that's structurally sound, even without the aid of a spline or biscuit joints. The glue itself is stronger than the wood fibers.
You needed to work with a lot of chemicals, and there was always this humidity, this smell of the animal's skin. So it was, actually a very tough job.
That the Anti-Slavery Society met at Brown Square has contributed to Newburyport's reputation, like many other places in Greater Boston, as a place of anti-slavery activism.
Now most sheep farms use electric clippers, which are quicker, but it's not as easy to be so careful. It takes some really incredible skill to hand shear a sheep.
You just watch the cars go by, whoever's going, oh, hi, Miss So-and-so, and you start talking. And so you commune that way.
Being involved with Historic New England allows me a constant sense of discovery. There's ongoing new research, the acquisition of new collections, and the centering of previously untold stories. Discoveries will only continue. I encourage you to visit historicnewengland.org. Become a member. Experience Historic New England yourself. I'm sure you'll find a new and interesting story about New England, this endlessly fascinating place I call home.
We're the leading preservation organization of its kind in the U.S. We're the oldest regional preservation organization in the country. And because age is good in some ways, we've been fortunate to build an unparalleled collection and set of programs over the years. We're focused on New England, but our concerns and commitment to preservation and learning from history are relevant nationwide and around the world. We've preserved over 100 properties through our easement program. We share hundreds of thousands of objects and documents from our collection online at historicnewengland.org. We present hundreds of programs online and in person every year. We're especially proud of our educational programs. We work with schools, after-school programs, libraries, and other partners across the entire region to connect children to history in authentic ways. We offer internships and fellowships to older students and academics to foster and support their work in history. Please know that we wouldn't be able to do our work if it weren't for the support of people from throughout New England and beyond. So in closing, I'd like to thank our members, our donors, for making the work of Historic New England possible. And for anyone who hasn't, please visit one of our properties, visit historicnewengland.org, see what you think, and consider becoming a member to get access to everything we have to offer. Would love to have you join us.
Thank you for joining us on this journey as we explored the remarkable history of New England. I hope the stories you've heard engaged your imagination or made you look at our region in a new way. I invite you to visit historicnewengland.org to learn more about these places and stories and learn how we can make history together.
Dark as the land that held us down, gone as it may be now. Good night, sleep is in your eyes. I think I may stay till the day falls down. And you heard love in every word. Carry the morning back to town, here on the way out. Do we belong to what went down, gone as it may?